Well, there is some breaking entertainment news this morning. It's been revealed Kylie Minogue had a second cancer diagnosis in 2021. In the star's new Netflix documentary, Minogue says she got through it again.
Seem to carry the weight of entire storms behind their smile, and you would never know it just by looking at them. Kylie Minogue is one of those people. For more than 4 decades, she has stood on stages across the world, her voice filling arenas, her presence lighting up every room she walks into. Fans have danced to her music at weddings, road trips, and late nights they will never forget. She became more than a pop star. She became a feeling. But what most people never saw, what the cameras never truly captured, is the extraordinary amount of pain, loss, and silent struggle that existed just beneath that dazzling surface. And now, at 57, as more of her story comes to light, people are beginning to understand that behind one of the most beloved careers in music history is a human story that is genuinely, deeply heartbreaking. To understand who Kylie Minogue is today, you have to go back to where it all began. She grew up in Melbourne, Australia, the daughter of a Welsh-born accountant and an Australian dancer and showgirl. From a young age, she was drawn to performance. There was something in her that needed to express itself, to connect, to be seen. She began acting as a teenager and quickly found her footing in Australian television, most notably on the long-running soap opera Neighbours, where she played the wholesome, lovable Charlene. Audiences adored her instantly. There was a warmth and a naturalness to her that felt completely genuine, because it was. She was not performing a character so much as offering a version of herself, and people responded to that in an enormous way. When her music career launched in the late 1980s, the transition felt almost inevitable. Her debut single became a massive hit, and suddenly this young woman from Melbourne was a global name. The momentum did not slow down. Through the late 1980s and 1990s, she reinvented herself multiple times, moving from bubblegum pop to more mature, sophisticated sounds. She worked with different producers, changed her image, and proved repeatedly that she was not a one-moment wonder but a genuine artist with lasting power. By the time she released what many consider her greatest work in the early 2000s, she had already survived more industry rejections and reinventions than most artists face in an entire lifetime. She had been written off more than once, and each time she came back stronger, more focused, and more herself than before. But the personal side of her life was always far more complicated than the public version suggested. Even during her most triumphant professional moments, she was navigating private emotional terrain that would have broken many people. One of the earliest and most lasting of these experiences was her relationship with Michael Hutchence, the lead singer of INXS. They were together in the late 1980s, and by all accounts the connection between them was intense, passionate, and deeply formative for her. She has spoken about him in interviews over the years with a tenderness that never quite disappears, describing him as someone who opened her eyes to a different kind of living, a different way of seeing the world and herself. He was older, more experienced, and moved through life with a kind of magnetic energy that drew people in effortlessly. For a young woman still figuring out who she was beyond the roles others had written for her, that relationship was significant in ways that went far beyond romance. When Michael Hutchence died in November 1997, the grief that followed was not something she could simply process and move past. It was a loss that settled into her quietly and stayed there. She has described how difficult it was to reconcile the memories of someone so full of life with the reality of his absence. There were no clean answers, no simple way to grieve, and no roadmap for how to carry that kind of loss while still showing up to work, to life, to the world. She did what many people do in those circumstances. She kept moving. She kept working. She kept giving the public the version of herself they needed to see, while privately holding something much heavier inside. That loss shaped her in ways she probably did not fully understand at the time, and it left a mark that she still carries with quiet dignity today. Then came 2005, and with it a moment that would redefine everything. Kylie was 36 years old, at what many consider the absolute peak of her career. She had just launched what was being described as one of the most anticipated concert tours of the year. The world was watching, Tickets had sold out, and everything pointed toward another extraordinary chapter in an already remarkable story. And then, just weeks before the tour was set to begin, she received a diagnosis of breast cancer. The tour was cancelled. The world, which had been focused on her music and her image, suddenly turned its attention to something far more serious. There was an outpouring of concern from fans around the globe, but behind the messages of love and support was a woman facing something deeply frightening, largely alone in the ways that illness forces every person to be alone, regardless of how many people surround them. The treatment that followed was grueling. Chemotherapy is not something that allows a person to maintain any version of their ordinary life. It dismantles you physically in ways that are difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. The fatigue goes bone deep. The nausea is relentless. The sense of your own body becoming unfamiliar and unreliable is deeply unsettling for anyone, but perhaps especially for someone whose physical presence has been so central to their public identity. She spoke honestly in later years about how challenging that period was, not just physically but psychologically. The fear of not knowing what the future holds, the uncertainty of treatment, the strange suspension of normal life while the rest of the world keeps turning. It is an isolating experience no matter who you are. She recovered. She returned to the stage. The world celebrated her comeback with genuine joy, and she gave that celebration everything she had. But those who were paying close attention noticed that something had shifted in her. The lightness was still there, the charisma, the showmanship, but underneath it was a new kind of depth. A person who has faced their own mortality carries that experience differently than someone who has not. It becomes part of how you see time, how you value ordinary days, how you relate to the people around you. Her return to music after cancer was not just a professional comeback. It was a statement about survival, resilience, and the refusal to let illness define the end of the story. What was not widely known at the time, and what has only emerged more recently, is that during this same period she was also quietly going through one of the most emotionally painful experiences a person can face. After her cancer diagnosis and treatment, Kylie carried a deep desire to become a mother. It was not a fleeting wish but something she longed for with real emotional weight. She pursued IVF treatment in the hope of making that possible, at one point making the extraordinarily difficult decision to delay beginning chemotherapy in order to attempt the procedure first. Think about what that decision actually meant. She chose to hold off on potentially life-saving treatment because she was not ready to close the door on motherhood without trying. That is not a small thing. That is a person at the intersection of two enormous fears, the fear of losing her health and the fear of losing a future she had always imagined for herself. The IVF treatment did not result in the outcome she had hoped for. She did not become a mother through that process, and the grief that came with that was something she carried privately, quietly, and with the kind of dignity that has always defined how she handles her most personal struggles. Her sister Dani has spoken about what that period was like for Kylie, describing how naturally nurturing she is, how much she has always poured love and care into the people around her, and how painful it was to watch her grieve a dream that did not come true. For fans who knew nothing of this at the time, the upbeat public-facing Kylie was still the only version they saw. But behind that image was a woman in the middle of a private heartbreak that had nothing to do with fame or music or public life. She found a way to transform that grief, as artists often do. Her song Flower is widely understood by those close to her to carry the emotional weight of that experience, a message shaped by love, longing, and the kind of acceptance that does not come easily but comes eventually when there is no other path forward. Music became, as it often has throughout her life, the place where the feelings that could not be spoken aloud found their expression. It is one of the things that makes her artistry so enduring. There is real emotional truth underneath the glitter in the choreography, and audiences feel that even when they do not know its specific source. The years that followed her recovery brought new creative heights and personal joys alongside continued private struggles. She found love again, experienced periods of deep happiness, and continued to produce music that resonated with audiences across multiple generations. But then, in 2021, something happened that she chose to keep entirely to herself. She received a second cancer diagnosis. 16 years after her first battle with the illness, it returned. And this time, she made a conscious decision not to share it publicly. No announcements, no statements, no carefully managed media disclosure. She simply went through it, as privately as it is possible to go through something like that when you are one of the most recognizable people on the planet. She has since described that period as one of the most emotionally exhausting of her life. She used the phrase "a shell of a person" to describe how she felt during that time, hollowed out by the combination of physical illness and the emotional effort of maintaining any kind of normal functioning. The idea of also managing public attention, of having her struggle become a news cycle, felt like more than she could bear. So she protected herself the only way she could, with silence. She leaned on a small circle of trusted people and faced the experience as quietly as the circumstances allowed. What makes this particularly poignant is the contrast it presents. In 2021, while she was privately fighting cancer for the second time, the world saw none of it. And in the years that followed, as she returned to full creative force and released music that became some of the most celebrated of her career, audiences experienced the joy of her work without any awareness of what it had cost her to get there. The global success she found with Padam Padam in 2023 was celebrated as a triumphant pop moment, a veteran artist having her moment in the sun again. And it was all of that. But it was also something else entirely for the woman living it, a person who had survived 2 cancer diagnoses, a profound grief around motherhood, the early loss of someone she deeply loved, and decades of personal struggle carried largely behind closed doors. At 57, Kylie Minogue is speaking more openly about these chapters of her life, not because she wants sympathy or because she is interested in rewriting her public image, but because she understands something important. She understands that many people go through devastating experiences in silence, without recognition, without support, and without the comfort of knowing that someone else has been through something similar and come out the other side. By sharing her story honestly, she offers something genuinely valuable to the world. She turns her private pain into something that can reach people who are struggling in their own quiet, unwitnessed ways. Her message about cancer is particularly important. She is clear that illness does not simply end when treatment ends. It stays with a person, in their body, in their thinking, in the way they relate to time and health and uncertainty. Healing is not a finish line. It is an ongoing, often invisible process that continues long after the medical interventions are complete. That is a truth that many people who have experienced serious illness understand deeply, and hearing someone of her stature say it plainly and honestly matters. What emerges from the full picture of her life, seen clearly and without the filter of celebrity mythology, is a portrait of someone who has shown up with remarkable consistency in the face of repeated adversity. She has lost love. She has faced her own mortality, twice. She has grieved a future she imagined for herself and had to build a different one. She has done all of this while being watched, while maintaining a public persona, while continuing to create work that brings genuine happiness to millions of people. That is an extraordinary thing to ask of any human being, and she has done it with a grace that deserves far more recognition than it typically receives. There is something in Kylie Minogue's story that speaks to a universal truth about human experience. The gap between what we show the world and what we carry inside is often vast, and the effort required to maintain that gap, to keep showing up, to keep giving, to keep moving forward when life is quietly dismantling you, is one of the most demanding things a person can be asked to do. She has been asked to do it repeatedly, and she has done it. Not perfectly, not without cost, but with a stubborn, beautiful insistence on living fully regardless of what life has thrown at her. At 57, she is not a cautionary tale. She is not a tragedy in the traditional sense, a life cut short or derailed or lost. She is something more nuanced and perhaps more inspiring than that. She is a person who has been through the fire, more than once, and has chosen each time to come back, to create, to connect, to be present. Her story is heartbreaking in parts, genuinely and deeply so. But it is also, in its totality, a story about the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit, about what is possible when a person refuses to be defined by their worst moments, and about the quiet courage it takes to keep choosing life, day after day, regardless of what yesterday looked like. That is the real Kylie Minogue. Not just the icon, not just the pop star, not just the survivor. But the full, complicated, deeply human person behind all of those labels, carrying more than most people will ever know, and still, somehow, shining.